The FBI sends target letters to 5 New Orleans police officers.
Then a target means we think you've committed a crime.
Fox 8 polices the police.
I feel like it's no accountability from the highest point to the lowest point.
They literally blow us off.
Our investigation uncovers potential corruption and mismanagement in the New Orleans Police Department.
They're breaching their trust to the public.
The findings so significant, an officer's family sued Fox 8 to keep us from airing undercover video.
I do think that this lawsuit was filed in a calculated manner to stop Fox 8 and Lee Zurich from running a story that the plaintiff or the folks associated with Sergeant Morrell didn't want to be published.
The FBI has launched an investigation into a program that has allowed some officers to earn more than $200,000 a year.
It's disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful.
It's a potential public safety issue.
Is the NOPD detail program broken?
Yes, absolutely.
Here's Lee Zurich with attention to the details.
We found officers breaking the rules and possibly the law. Now the FBI is investigating at least 11 NOPD officers and sent target letters to at least 5 of them. It all started with our first story where we found one sergeant who, instead of being behind the wheel of his patrol car, appeared to be behind the wheel of a race car.
30 yards, which is significantly.
This police officer seems to want you to believe he can be in 2 places at one time.
This is just blatant greed. That's all it is. There's no reason.
Over the past 3 years, NOPD officer Todd Morrell has repeatedly been one of the highest paid officers in the force, earning about $200,000 a year, adding to his base pay by working overtime and off-duty detail shifts. But our investigation has uncovered the NOPD is paying Morrell while he appears to be racing cars. This is him behind the wheel of his race car. Morrell is a frequent driver at NOLA Motorsports track on the West Bank. His Facebook page shows he's an avid race car driver. On June 21st, 2020, official online race results show Todd Morrell finished first in a race at the West Bank Motorsports Park. The race at 9 a.m. that morning. But look at Morrell's NOPD timesheets. That same day, he had a shift that started at 5 a.m. and lasted most of the day. So at the same time Morrell finished first in a recreational race, taxpayers wrote him a check to be at work.
Well, I don't care if he's racing cars, Lee, or if he's at home with his children, or he's playing baseball. When you clock in to be a police officer on duty, that's a sacred responsibility. And you are there from the time you clock in to the time you clock out. You are being paid by the city of New Orleans, by us, the taxpayers, to be a police officer. Those hours should be reserved 100% for your work as a police officer.
But documents we reviewed show this is not an isolated incident. June 6 of this year, Morrell finished second in a 16.5-mile race. According to results, the race started at 8 a.m. Once again, timesheets show Morrell had an unscheduled NOPD shift that started at 6 a.m. and lasted until 2 in the afternoon. Let's go farther back. Morrell finished third in a race in 2017. The timestamp on that December 3rd session, 9 a.m. NOPD records show that same morning Morrell was on the NOPD clock from 6 a.m. until 2:35 in the afternoon. On that day, after that 9 a.m. race, Morrell raced again at 11:10 in the morning, again at the same time as his NOPD shift. NOPD policy clearly states officers shall not engage in activities or personal business which would cause them to neglect or be inattentive to duty.
You are breaching the duty you owe to the public that you've sworn to protect, that you are going to observe the rules of the police department. And we're paying you to be a police officer. And we don't have a surplus of police officers right now. We need everyone that can work when they're supposed to work.
But there's more. Morrell frequently works off-duty details, patrolling the neighborhood adjacent to the fairgrounds. In 2005, after approving slot machines, the city council passed an ordinance requiring the fairgrounds to hire 4 off-duty police officers 24 hours a day to patrol the neighborhood. In fact, Morrell's mother, former Councilwoman Cynthia Hedge Morrell, voted in favor of that ordinance. But our investigation raises questions as to whether Morrell is always fulfilling his detail duty. January 23rd of this year, Morrell claimed to work a 12-hour detail shift in the neighborhood, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. But results show Morrell raced on the West Bank that day, driving in 3 races, in the morning at 9:40 and 11:35, and at 2:45 in the afternoon, all during his fairgrounds area detail shift. In fact, that day, the National Auto Sport Association NOLA event streamed a live awards video on Facebook. There's Morrell handing out awards, even giving one to himself.
First place, Todd Morrell.
Morrell streaming live on Facebook on the same day the NOPD paid him for a 12-hour detail shift on the other side of the river. For that detail shift, Morrell earned about $400. 2 months later, March 13th, Morrell had a 6-hour detail shift from 6 a.m. till noon. That morning, race records show he raced cars at NOLA Motorsports, though, at 8, 9:40, and 11:35.
Is this potentially payroll fraud?
Oh, of course it is. But more importantly, the police department should not be willing to accept this kind of behavior.
We found at least 18 instances where Morrell appears to race cars while also collecting a taxpayer paycheck.
Does some outside agency need to investigate this?
Yes, of course. This is the parish of Orleans. That means it's the district attorney for the parish of Orleans. The district attorney, my former student, Jason Williams, you better look into this. You better see what's going on, because this can be easily criminal fraud, misuse of public funds.
We reached out to Morrell. The attorney for the Police Association emailed us back to say, per NOPD policy, Morrell is unable to address this matter with us. We then asked the attorney if he could provide us with any information or comment. He told us at this time he couldn't speak on the matter. But the race results raise questions about whether an NOPD officer prioritized his race car over protecting residents. Like in 2018, results show Morrell raced 9 different days at NOLA Motorsports. On almost all of those, 8 of 9 records show during his racing, he appeared to disregard his NOPD duty shift. In Tulane law professor Joel Friedman's opinion, violating the law enforcement oath of honor.
God forbid something happens in your home, Lee, when you're not there. Who do you want your wife to call? You want her to call, the public library? No. You want her to call the police, because you want to trust that the police will do their job. They have a very difficult job, and we should give them all the respect. But they deserve the respect if they're upholding their end of the bargain.
Scared about retaliation, it's not easy to get public reaction to police misconduct. But we found one group of neighbors livid after seeing our stories. People who live near the fairgrounds have complained for years that NOPD detail patrols were rarely seen. Some even raised concerns at a 2019 meeting where the NOPD told them officers were patrolling. However, our stories led residents to believe the NOPD wasn't telling the truth.
At the end of the day, I feel like it's no accountability from the highest point to the lowest point. And that's just what we're seeing. And we, the residents who live around here, we have to deal with the consequences of that.
They literally blow us off. And now that this story has come out, we're not here to pass any judgment on who's doing what. But if the patrols haven't been patrolling, the fairgrounds, Churchill Downs, has a responsibility, not only to the neighbors, but to the ordinance that was created for them to have that license. And they need to be in compliance.
Next, we found officers claiming to be in 2 places at once, appearing to be on the clock for the NOPD and performing off-duty details at the same time.
Getting paid for 2 jobs at one time usually isn't possible.
And it's not 1 or 2 instances.
Of course. That's why I said it's so blatant. It's so pervasive. It's so consistent.
Unless you're part of this select group of NOPD officers earning six-figure paychecks.
And this is absolutely shocking, both from the individual police officer and from the departmental perspective.
The NOPD allows officers to work off-duty detail shifts, a way to earn extra money and provide protection for businesses, special events, schools, and neighborhood groups. NOPD policy clearly states officers can only work these detail shifts during the hours they are off-duty. Of course, that means they can only work either an NOPD shift or detail shift, not both. But by analyzing NOPD timesheets, we found dozens of examples of a few officers being paid twice for what appears to be detail and duty work at the same time, essentially receiving two checks at once. In 2020 and 2021, we found 14 instances. Timesheets and detailed documents show Officer Michael Stolbert might have done this, being paid twice for about 33 hours of work, almost a full week. For example, on June 18th of last year, Stolbert worked an NOPD shift from 1 in the afternoon until 9:35 at night. But look at his detail work for that day. From 1,800 hours, 6 o'clock in the evening until midnight, he worked a detail shift, patrolling the neighborhood around the fairgrounds. So according to NOPD records, for 3 hours and 35 minutes that day, Stolbert worked an NOPD shift and a fairgrounds detail shift at the same time.
Well, the taxpayers are not going to be happy if police officers are supposed to be on duty and they're assigned a private detail when they're supposed to be on duty, because of course if an officer or any public employee is on duty, they are collecting a salary from the taxpayers during that period, and so the taxpayers and the voters have an expectation that they will actually be doing the taxpayers' work during that time period and not the work for a private business.
On April 9th of this year, NOPD timesheets show Officer Todd Morrell worked an 8-hour unscheduled shift from 6 a.m. until 2 in the afternoon. But detail records from that same day show at the same time, Morrell also allegedly worked a detail shift in the fairgrounds neighborhood from 6 a.m. until 2 in the afternoon. Same shift, two different places, being paid twice.
But the officers certainly know if they're on a duty or a
Of course they do, Lee. It's double. They're both wrong. The police officer is wrong, but why are the police officers doing it? You know why they're doing it? Because they can. Because they're getting away with it.
Todd Morrell's brother, Nicholas, also appears to have instances of working details and NOPD shifts at the same time. Here's one example. On January 20th, 2018, Morrell worked a fairgrounds detail from noon until 6. But according to timesheets, 2 hours into that detail, he also went on the clock for his NOPD shift for 4 hours, working for two different entities, being paid twice.
There's no reason for saying while you're on duty, when you clock in during a particular amount of time, when you're being paid to be a police officer, you're also doing something else, including a detail you got, by the way, from the police department. No individual police officer can go to some restaurant and say, give me a detail. It doesn't work that way. You know that. All the requests have to come into the police department. The police department has an office that handles this. They allocate these things. So they must have a process by knowing, okay, here's a 12 to 6 slot, noon to 6. Who in our registry of available officers is not working that day at 12 to 6? Let's see. Well, they must not be doing that because we have plenty of examples.
It's important to note the timesheets of many other officers don't show this disparity.
There's always the possibility for errors.
Donovan Livicari is the general counsel for the Louisiana Fraternal Order of Police. He says those errors could come in the detail sheets because officers don't enter their own hours.
I think it's amazing to me that there can be a payroll system that's administered by the police department and a payroll system that's administered by another element of the city of New Orleans, and for those payroll systems to allow two different working periods at the exact same time. I don't understand how that happens.
Who's auditing them? This is not hard to find.
Skip Gallagher is a private citizen who acts as an independent NOPD watchdog. He's followed and tracked this detail program closely, including these double duties.
Your records are right in front of you. It's in black and white.
Gallagher says taxpayers need to be outraged by what he's able to see right in front of his eyes.
It's just so disappointing. It's so disappointing. This is the people that we hope are enforcing the law, and they'd be following their own rules and regulations.
Gallagher says most officers follow the rules and law, but he's concerned these officers might be able to manipulate the system to add to their paychecks.
Just to be absolutely clear, most of the NOPD doesn't do details. Half the NOPD does little or no details, and we have this small group who are doing details and doing details at the same time where they're supposed to be on duty, or vice versa. It just is so infuriating, and it needs to stop.
The NOPD keeps its off and on duty records separate, so we spent hours doing the monotonous task of building spreadsheets, logging officers' total time each day, every day of the past 5 years. We uncovered officers allegedly working long hours with little to no breaks between shifts, repeatedly breaking department policy.
In his day job, Skip Gallagher teaches students at UNO how to examine and analyze. He's a professor of forensic science.
So you have a lot of interest in people who do right or wrong.
Yes.
When he's off, Gallagher spends much of his time analyzing NOPD records.
Is the NOPD detail program broken?
Yes, absolutely.
What he's found, a group of officers repeatedly breaking NOPD policy. Officers responsible for enforcing the law, breaking internal policies they're expected to follow.
I can only imagine a good trained accountant looking at this, and I would think it would be very easy for them to find out what's going on and to enforce NOPD policy and state law and get compliance with these officers.
NOPD policy limits the amount of hours an officer can work over a 24-hour period to 16 hours and 35 minutes. That includes work hours, overtime, and off-duty details. By analyzing timesheets for duty shifts and details, we found a group of officers consistently breaking that policy. In May of 2018, Officer Todd Morrell worked more than the policy allows for 20 days of the month. For example, on May 4th, records show he started his NOPD shift at 11 a.m. and went off the clock at 7:35 that night. But 25 minutes later, Morrell went back on the clock for a detail shift, patrolling the area around the fairgrounds. That shift lasted from 2000 hours, 8 p.m., until midnight. But when the calendar turned to May 5th, Morrell continued to work that detail until 11 a.m. But then Morrell stayed on the clock and went from detail back to duty, working from 11 a.m. until 7:35 at night. All totaled nearly 33 consecutive hours of work, a clear violation of the policy.
The policy should be followed.
Sure, and I think a lot of the issues within the city are not just individuals finding ways to break the rules. I think it's a lot of that supervisors are not enforcing the written rules that are on the books. I think that's really the primary problem.
In 2018, timesheets show Todd Morrell violated this policy 107 times. That includes a stretch right after Thanksgiving, when over an 80-hour period, Morrell worked duty in detail for 71 of those hours. Only 9 hours off duty in more than 3 days.
It's a potential public safety issue. I mean, there's a reason why we put time limits on the amount of time that first responders, as well as medical professionals, emergency room professionals can work, and it's because they deal with life or death situations. And when people are dealing with life or death situations, you need them to be alert and you need them to be focused. I mean, if somebody's been up for 24 30 hours, they're not going to be alert and focused. So I think that's the public safety issue there.
At least a handful of officers frequently break this departmental rule. That includes Officer Matthew Edersheim. For the first 6 months of this year, records show he violated the policy 46 times, including a stretch in June where he worked 67 hours, only taking 9 off.
Shouldn't a police officer make sure that he or she is upholding the policy of his or her own department?
Certainly, and I think that there's over 1,500 pages worth of policies for people to be familiar with, and sometimes there's policies that people are unfamiliar with. It's a lot to keep up with on a daily basis, and they do their best.
So are you saying some of the officers may not be aware of this policy?
Well, I suppose it's a possibility that there are officers who are unaware of that policy.
But emails we obtained show officers have been made aware of this policy. We found emails from a lieutenant to the entire police department. A similar email goes out most months, reminding officers about the policy, limiting the amount of time they can work over a 24-hour period.
Sometimes these assignments are given to them by OPSE and they don't want to turn them down. Sometimes things run a little longer than they're supposed to. Sometimes the 24-hour period is kind of hard to calculate.
Regardless, Donovan Livicaria of the Fraternal Order of Police says the policy is unneeded. Police are able to police their own health and rest.
It's a decision that every one of us makes every day as to how much sleep we need to get, and these are adults, grown men and women who know their bodies and they know what they need.
But there's a policy in place, I think, for a reason to make sure that they're rested, right?
Look, the policy's in place and the policy should be enforced. I'm not arguing that people should disregard the policy. That's not my argument. I don't believe the policy is necessary.
We found more officers violating this policy. In the first half of this year, records show Eric Giller did it 13 times, John Butler 23, and in August of 2020, when Officer Michael Stalbert worked about 30 hours straight with no time off to rest. In 2011, the NOPD entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice to clean up the department. Part of the problem 10 years ago, the detail system that the Department of Justice called troubling, writing it contributes to compromising officer fatigue. The consent decree criticized officers being allowed to work an overnight detail and then going to his or her NOPD job, adding federal investigators heard complaints that officers were too tired to perform their duties. The consent decree led to the creation of a separate office, the Office of Police Secondary Employment, to oversee the program and institute reforms like this new policy, limiting the number of hours officers can work. But more than 10 years later, this forensic scientist worries the problems a decade ago are still pervasive in the NOPD, an agency paying little attention to the details.
It worries me that one of the departments that was put in place to control this or to make sense of this or stop this was the Office of Secondary Employment. And what they seem most concerned with is their fees that are required to support their staff, more so than whether the rules and regulations of the NOPD are actually enforced.
And we had more feedback from people in the fairgrounds area reacting to our reports, with some neighbors telling us when they did get in touch with officers, those officers weren't responsive.
Sometimes they'll answer, sounds like they're sleeping, depending on the time of the day. Sometimes they don't answer.
What does that tell you if they don't answer?
That they're not there.
The NOPD has a department that investigates officers, the Public Integrity Bureau, PIB. But as we dug deeper, we uncovered high-ranking officers of the PIB breaking departmental policies and possibly the law.
Hours Hours before the Texas Longhorns and Georgia Bulldogs kicked off in the 2019 Sugar Bowl, records show NOPD officer Sabrina Richardson started an off-duty detail shift at the Superdome, a shift that started at 4:30 p.m. and went to midnight. At that point, when the calendar moved to January 2nd, Richardson moved to another detail shift, patrolling the neighborhood near the fairgrounds. And for 12 hours, from midnight until noon, Richardson allegedly worked that shift. After being off the clock for 25 minutes, Richardson then started a regular NOPD duty shift. And from 12:25 until 9 that night, Richardson worked her on-duty shift. For 28 consecutive hours, this now NOPD captain allegedly stayed awake on the clock from 4:30 p.m. on January 1st until 9 p.m. on January 2nd.
This is terrible. This shows about the cancerous nature of the police department.
Sabrina Richardson was part of the NOPD's Public Integrity Bureau, the team of officers responsible for policing the police. We've now uncovered timesheets and pictures for Richardson and other officers in the Public Integrity Bureau that reveal violations similar to others we've dug up.
The PIB officers are flouting the rules.
In 4 years, we found 26 instances of Sabrina Richardson double dipping, working a detail and duty shift at the same time. One example, March 20th, 2019, from 3 till 7 p.m., she worked an off-duty detail shift at Restaurant Depot, but at the same time, NOPD records show her on the clock for a duty shift. For this story, we also requested every time a license plate reader camera captured Richardson's unit. The city has more than 100 of these cameras. The NOPD would only hand over 6 months' worth. They say the rest have been deleted. In a 5-month period, we found 8 instances where Richardson worked a detail, but the cameras caught her police unit miles away. Like November 27th of last year, leading up to the Bayou Classic, Richardson worked a detail at Champion Square from 11 a.m. till 4 p.m. But at 1:07, a license plate reading camera captured this picture of her police unit on the West Bank, across the river, 5 miles away from Champion Square. About an hour later, another camera caught her police unit on Chef Highway in New Orleans East, 6.5 miles away from Champion Square. In November of last year, the NOPD moved Richardson from the ranking officer at the Public Integrity Bureau to leading the 3rd District in Gentilly and Lakeview.
She's a captain. She does all of these things, and what happens? Is she demoted? No. Is she suspended? No. Is she terminated? No. She's given control over a department. She's put in charge of a unit, of a division.
Of a district.
Of a district. All the police officers in that district report to her. If she's doing this, well, I assume I can do the same. Everybody knows what's going on. Apparently everybody but the chief of police knew what was going on and did nothing. And for her now to be the head of a district after all of this is shocking.
We found discrepancies with other officers in the Public Integrity Bureau, like Wayne Jacques. 2 days after Thanksgiving, the management company that runs the Superdome paid Jacques for 11 hours of off-duty detail work to help navigate traffic for last year's Bayou Classic. The game kicked off at 4 in the afternoon. 1 hour before it started, as traffic likely picked up, Jacques wasn't helping his fellow officers in the detail. Instead, a license plate reader camera tracked his NOPD unit a mile away from the dome at Orleans Avenue in the I-10. A week earlier, November 20th, Jacques had an off-duty detail at Columbia Park apartment complex. That detail 4 hours, from 7 to 11 a.m. But halfway through the shift, 9:12 in the morning, a license plate reading camera captured this picture of his police unit on the West Bank at General de Gaulle and Shirley Drive, across the river 10 miles from his paid detail shift. In November and December of last year, we found 10 instances where those license plate readers caught Jacques' NOPD unit at least 1 mile away from his detail shift.
But what's worse is that it's the PIB officers who are the ones who are supposed to monitor this. And of course, we know that they didn't for years until you revealed it. Why? Because they were doing it also.
It's important to note when we ask Superdome management if NOPD officers are allowed to leave the premises while working a detail, A Dome spokesperson responded, "It is not permitted."
Why would you have somebody who has flouted the law and flouted the regulations be a judge of other police? It makes no sense whatsoever.
We even found a former PIB employee with questionable timesheets. Sergeant Trinell Franklin investigated her fellow officers while working at the Public Integrity Bureau. She retired in 2020. We found Franklin likely broke NOPD policy by calling in sick, but still working details. 14 instances in 4 years. One example, January 30th, 2020. She called in sick for her NOPD shift, but still worked 4 hours of off-duty detail at the Walmart in New Orleans East. And this has helped these officers make plenty of extra money. Take 2019. Between detail and duty work, Trinell Franklin made $132,000. Sabrina Richardson, $141,000. Wayne Jacques, $155,000. Officers responsible for deciding whether fellow officers violate rules or the law with questionable timesheets themselves.
For these people, of all people who know all the rules and are there to judge their peers, to be blatantly and repeatedly over a significant length of time violating clear police policy in a way that only enhances their financial being is really disappointing and distressing. You're right, they should be held to a higher standard. Judges are always held to a higher standard. I mean, who am I to judge others if I'm not at least being held to a higher standard?
We requested more license plate reader pictures for many other officers in our stories, but after initially releasing the records for these 2 officers, the NOPD told us it wouldn't do it again because of privacy concerns. Our attorney advised us not to fight it in court. The Public Integrity Bureau received an official complaint on Sabrina Richardson, forcing the Bureau to investigate. PIB recused itself, and homicide detective Nick Gernon was selected to investigate. Sources tell us Gernon found 44 different violations by Richardson, some possibly criminal, including finding 9 instances where license plate reading cameras spotted her NOPD unit while Richardson was paid for a detail. That report has been forwarded to the Orleans Parish District Attorney. Our reports uncovered other officers breaking NOPD policy and possibly something more serious. For example, from September 26, 2018 to December 2, 2019, 14 consecutive months, NOPD Sergeant Renee Benjamin's timesheets show he never took a day off. The next year, in 2020, Benjamin claimed to work 360 days, taking only 5 days off the entire year. A review of Benjamin's detail and duty shifts show he regularly clocked 16-hour days. We also found instances where his detail and duty shifts overlapped or backed up against each other, leaving no room for travel. And he approved timesheets for his son, who is also an NOPD officer, which is against its nepotism policy. And we looked at another officer. Because of detail work, Brian Sullivan made more than any other officer in the force, annually around $231,000. We found instances of Sullivan double dipping and working 2 details at one time. The action from our stories was swift. 2 days after our first report, the NOPD temporarily suspended 29 officers from doing detail work, and the department launched an internal investigation.
We are no stranger to difficult situations. This is something that's been brought to our attention, thanks to you, and we're going to do our due diligence in holding ourselves accountable. This is something that we've never shied away from. We've had challenges in the past, and we faced them head on, and we will continue to do the same with this particular incident as well.
So there could be future sanctions against officers?
That is a part of the disciplinary process, absolutely. Right now, they're just suspended from having their detail privileges, which it is a privilege to be able to work a secondary job while with the New Orleans Police Department.
That internal investigation is ongoing. Coming up on Attention to the Details.
What's damning is not that you have a video of it. What's damning is that he did it. Your video proves that he did it.
Undercover video an officer's family tried to stop from being aired. That's coming up next. Now back to the first officer we told you about, Todd Morrell. His wife tried to stop us from running undercover video. He's, of course, the officer we found racing cars while being paid for NOPD duty and detail work. Morrell filed a temporary restraining order in court saying we harassed and threatened her and tried to get a judge to stop us from airing the story. A judge eventually threw out the case.
I do think that this lawsuit was filed in a calculated manner to stop Fox 8 and Lee Zurich from running a story that the plaintiff or the folks associated with Sergeant Morrell didn't want to be published.
Here's the story and the video they tried to stop us from airing.
Undercover video of a police officer who during this exact time is being paid to be in his patrol car.
What's damning is not that you have a video of it. What's damning is that he did it. Your video proves that he did it.
This video from October 23rd, just a few weeks ago. That's NOPD officer Todd Morrell stepping off his porch, walking his dog at 7:30 in the morning. That's a problem because his timesheet shows at that exact time the NOPD was paying Morrell to work a police detail in the Fairgrounds neighborhood.
The evil is that he did it, that he's knowingly taking this money for work that he didn't do. It's as if I'm a lawyer and you hired me to write a contract for you and I never wrote it and I sent you a bill. I worked 10 hours on the contract. I didn't work one second. It's exactly the same. I defrauded you. It's no different. It's no different.
The records show Morrell was paid for a 12-hour shift at the fairgrounds that day, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. But take a look at the video. There's his patrol car pulling in the night before at 7:27. It's still there at 6 in the morning when he clocks in on his detail shift. Just after 7 in the morning, he lets his dog out. Around 8:15, hops into his personal car to move it in the driveway. At 10:24, there's Morrell taking out the trash. He leaves in another personal vehicle a minute later and returns at 12:16. At 1:31, Morrell returns again and walks up to the driveway. He did get in his police unit a few minutes later, but he's not gone long. After about 20 minutes, he returned. We then saw him walk his dog and take out the trash, all during his 12-hour detail shift, a shift he was paid about $400.
So what I'm saying is the fact that he got paid for a detail that he did in fact not work because he was home at that time tells me this is not an accident. This is not a clerical error.
These new detailed documents, part of new records we recently received from the NOPD. Also in the records, documents that show Morrell double billed, working NOPD duty and detail shifts at the same time. On October 11th, according to Morrell's timesheets, he worked an NOPD shift from 6:25 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. But look at his detail records, noon to 6 p.m. So from noon until 3, he was paid for detail and duty work. The next day, October 12th, Morrell went on the detail clock at 6 a.m. and on the NOPD clock 25 minutes later. For the next 5.5 hours until noon, he was paid for a duty and detail shift.
They have the right rules in place, but if they don't enforce them, that's on the police department. They have to do better.
Tulane law professor Joel Friedman says the information in our stories is infuriating to him, and it should be to most of the police force, who always follow the rules and regulations.
At a time when we need all the help we can get from our police department, one of the evils of this kind of behavior is it destroys the morale of the good cops, who are undoubtedly a majority of the force. But when a good cop sees this kind of thing going on, what's the incentive for the good cop to stay the good cop?
Days after that story aired, Todd Morrell retired from the NOPD. Attention to the details got results. The NOPD suspended more than 24 officers from performing details and launched an investigation. We also learned the FBI has launched a separate investigation into the detail program and at least 11 NOPD officers. We know 5 officers: Todd Morrell, his brother Nicholas Morrell, Michael Stallbert, Renee Benjamin, and Brian Sullivan received target letters from the feds. Following our stories, the FBI sent a subpoena for racing records related to Todd and Nicholas Morrell.
It is disappointing whenever any officer is under criminal investigation, whether they are patrolman, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, deputy chief, or even myself. It can be concerning. But I think what we have to also look at is that, for whatever reason, there's this, perception that there's this subculture that is lying within our department that just does not exist. Right now, we have some outliers, we have some things in which we're looking into, but we also recognize that there were some mistakes made on everyone's behalf with regards to this particular detailed investigation.
Many of the officers who were originally suspended from performing detail work have been allowed to resume details. However, the NOPD says it identified and fixed a gap between its payroll system and the Office of Secondary Police Employment, which allowed the alleged double dipping to occur. It has now fixed that gap and can now regularly monitor an officer's off and on-duty schedules together. The department also began performing regular audits on the detail program this year. A decade ago, a federal consent decree was supposed to overhaul and reform the program. Back then, the Justice Department called it the aorta of corruption. But 10 years later, as the NOPD prepares to move out from under the decree, it's clear everyone involved still needs to pay more attention to the details. Up next, we switch gears, diving into questionable disaster pay, contracts, charges, and public bids paid by the city of Kenner.
It's all a transparency issue. None of this is transparent.
Possibly millions of dollars in misspent money, and what we uncovered launched an FBI investigation. Isle of Secrecy is up next.